The Lord be with you.
And with thy spirit.
Let us pray. Direct us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works, begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally by thy mercy obtain everlasting life, through Jesus Christ our Lord.
Amen.
This is lesson number 2 of Holy Matrimony, class number 18, and the overall topic is romanticism and love. And I apologize for not being here last Sunday, but we will press on and we will continue. Are there any questions or anything lingering from the first lesson on holy matrimony from week before last? If not, let us begin. I'm going to begin by reading 2 quotations. First, every person has a right to human fulfillment in a sexual and mutually supportive relationship. And quotation number 2, love is the experience of knowing that another person cares deeply, warmly, acceptingly, and dependably. This is the most indispensable need of any human being, to which all other heart hungers are tributary. To have a steady source of warmth and affection to offset the chill of depersonalizing experiences in the outside world. Such love given and received in marriage feeds self-esteem. Knowing that she loves me through my ups and downs makes me feel 10 feet tall. Love helps one define his identity more sharply as he experiences himself vividly in both passionate and quiet caring. It reinforces a feeling of inner security by making the marriage a harbor where one is safe from many of the storms and threats of everyday life. Love is a force that welds a relationship at its points of meeting. The ancient insight of St. Paul has been confirmed and reconfirmed in the social sciences, counseling relationships, and successful marriage. But the greatest of these is love. Now, how did these 2 quotations sound? Is that the way you think about love? Well, that first quotation is, of course, a slogan in support of gay rights. The second is from the book The Intimate Marriage by Howard and Charlotte Kleinbell. And when the book was published, he was a professor of theology at Claremont College in California. She was a psychiatric social worker. The second quotation actually is not so much a description of love as it is of the experience of being loved. In fact, it is merely romanticism, which is an illusion. Marriage, on the other hand, is a grappling with reality. About 2000 BC, at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, society was agricultural. People lived in stable villages surrounded by walls. They farmed the land which surrounded the town. It was largely a matrilineal society, if not matriarchal. They considered children to be the product of the mother, and the father's part was thought to be insignificant. Genealogy was reckoned through the mother. Their religion consisted of the worship of a goddess who personified the forces of nature. Her idols were large statues of a woman whose belly was an open furnace, and they worshipped her by throwing babies into its flames. They said that every year she died and was reborn again in the springtime. Persephone of the Greek myth is a vision of her. Around 1500 BC, there was an invasion of a patriarchal people into Greece and Italy. They were people of the Viking stock, blonde and blue-eyed, Indo-Europeans, aka Indo-Aryans, who worshipped a masculine sky god. And about the same time, there came into Canaan or Palestine the Hebrews, who were dark, but who also worshipped a sky god. In Greece, they called that god Zeus. In Italy, they called him Job. And in Canaan, they called him Jehovah or Yahweh. They thought of babies as being the product of the father. The mother was sort of like an oven in which they were baked. The Hebrews, for example, were very careful about their wives because no man wanted to raise another's brat. 1,000 years later, about 500 BC, in those places, fertility religions began to revive in the form of the mystery religions, the first important rival of Christianity. The mystery religions were matriarchal, orgiastic, and anti-intellectual. I believe gave way to I feel. For its first 300 years or so, until about 313 AD, Christianity was an underground religion. But by 400 AD, it was dominant throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. At least it was dominant in the cities, but fertility religion survived in the waterfront slums of the seaport cities, which was almost all of the cities, and in the countryside among the hillbillies. The very word pagan itself comes from the Latin word pagus, which means countryside. The country folk tended to remain pagan. 2 centuries later, in the 600s, the new religion of Islam swept throughout the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Islam was patriarchal and puritanical. However, Puritanism is always vulnerable to its mirror, which is paganism. Islam also swept westward across North Africa, bringing along with it the surviving paganism of the eastern seaport slums. From there it spread up into Spain and Europe, and the paganism which it carried along with it combined with the rural paganism of the European countryside. And as a result, between 900 and 1100 AD, strange things began happening all over Europe. There was an outbreak of Romanticism. Teenagers were sneaking out after dark to gather in the meadows and to hold what they called courts of love. They would choose a maiden to be the queen of love, and the other maidens would serve as her ladies in waiting. They chose one of the boys to be her consort, and the other boys paired off with the girls. Then they performed intricate figure dances until they were all thoroughly excited. And finally, they engaged in sexual intercourse, and then just before dawn, they sneaked back home. Their parents felt helpless to stop or control it. Now, you know the origin of folk dances and square dances. It came to be called going courting. Homecoming queens and even beauty pageants can be traced back to this custom. In the springtime, teenage boys ran off from home and wandered around with guitars or lutes, singing love songs as the weather was bearable. Then in the winter, they would attach themselves to some estate until the weather was mild enough to hit the road again. These teenage boys were called troubadours, and their songs were in the vulgar language, which was actually a broken down form of Latin, the Roman language. Thus, the songs which the troubadours sang in that language were called romances. Their songs were scarcely more than translations of the ancient hymns of the fertility goddesses. In fact, the first literary composition in a Romance language was the romance of the lovers Tristan and, is it Isolde? Isolde. The famous novel by Cervantes, Don Quixote, was written as a parody or a criticism of Romanticism, but it miscarried and the people took it seriously. The modern musical comedy Man of La Mancha is based upon it, and the song from it, The Impossible Dream, became very popular. The fertility rites, which survived in the countryside, were referred to as witchcraft. And so in that sense, the country girl, Joan of Arc, really was a witch. Witchcraft, fertility religion, is still with us. And today in our country, there are still people who openly claim to be witches. By the early 1800s, Romanticism was in full flower in Europe and America. Marriage was expected to produce romantic values, but it could not and it cannot. Either all those romantic expectations had to be abandoned, or the institution of marriage would disintegrate. And that is exactly what is happening faster and faster because people are clinging to romantic illusion. Actually, most people don't know that there is an actual, real alternative. So the nature of Romanticism. Deep in his heart, Johnny and Mary is a romantic. At 15, he knows he's made for rapture. At 25, he'll settle for happiness. At 35, for peace. At 45, for security. Or he has a midlife crisis and then starts looking for his dream girl all over again. The Christian believes, on the other hand, that we were made for ecstasy, all right, but he also knows that it is available only in heaven. The romantic pagan believes it is available on earth, personal fulfillment in a sexual and mutually supportive relationship, as we heard at the beginning, but somewhere else or in different circumstances or with someone else. The search for the Holy Grail in the Middle Ages was an example of romanticism. So was the Puritans' trip to New England to found a really righteous community. Communism is romanticism. The destruction of all the decadent institutions will allow the goodness of man to achieve paradise here on earth. So is modern political liberalism. Change will produce social harmony, prosperity, and happiness. And likewise, conservatism in an opposite manner, longing for the good old days. The romantic illusion always slips through our fingers. Remember what Yogi Berra is supposed to have said: when you come to a fork in the road, take it. But we can't, because as we use our freedom, we end up using it up. The tired old romantic is a pitiful figure, and his motto is, if only. This plaintive old song, with its touch of sadness, might be his theme song. With someone just like you, a pal that's good and true, I'd like to leave it all behind and go and find a place that's known to God alone. A little place that we can call our own. We can build a little nest somewhere in the West and let the rest of the world go by. Note, if it is not that we cannot buy happiness, but that our happiness lies in submitting to God's will in circumstances that we cannot dominate and we cannot control. It seems that in this world, the closest most folks ever come to the total absorption of self, body, and soul is in an experience of delight, is in sexual orgasm. And so sex is found hovering at the center of all of our romantic aspirations and strivings. Perhaps the most powerful single influence on what young people expect from the boy-girl relationship comes from popular love songs. Of course, beginning at the last half of the 20th century, more and more of our most popular songs are no longer about love, but of course they are about hate, rape, lust, and violence. But our traditional popular songs have been almost identical with the most ancient of pagan hymns, not to mention the Song of Solomon in the Old Testament, which appears to allude to the ancient myth of the love of God and goddess, on which the fertility of nature was thought to depend. Apart from the songs of hate and violence, the popular song is a love song and a sad song, and its characteristics are usually these. In these songs, men speak to women. The language of religion is used. She is either an angel or a goddess, and heaven is in your arms. Romantic love is said to be the greatest good. Love is the greatest thing. Love makes the world go round. Fatalism. It is all arranged by fate. That old black magic has me in its spell. Or lust. The word love means need, want, or desire. But to think of love in these terms is to be a 5-year-old, and more about this later. The man is, of course, the servant of the goddess. Sexual intercourse equals death. In romantic operas, the lovers are united only in the grave. Romeo and Juliet, Aida, or Tosca. Romanticism is actually quite natural. Paganism has permeated the last 4,000 years of human history, and it comes naturally to feel that divinity is female, because in our formative years, our infancy, we are with our mother most of the time. Daddy, on the other hand, is exotic, out of sight, out of mind. And the masculine sky god of Jews and Christians is likewise exotic. Mother is the earliest embodiment of wisdom, power, and providence which human beings experience. All men tend to be afraid of women because the normal historic reaction to an experience of God or goddess is fear. Men know deep down inside that if you don't go to bed with a goddess and live, I probably couldn't bring it off, and if I did, it would kill me. Furthermore, women have a hard time convincing themselves that they are goddesses. It is cruel to expect a woman to be a goddess because she is doomed to fail and then feel guilty about it. So the result, when a man fails to find human fulfillment in a sexual and mutually supportive relationship, he does not assume that he was expecting an unreasonable thing, but rather that he has simply married the wrong woman. So, going to the real word of love and looking at love itself. Our hero is a 14-year-old boy, 6'3", 150 pounds, size 13 feet and pimples. One thing he is certain of is that no girl in her right mind would look at him twice. In fact, he is afraid of girls, but he's also fascinated by them. In short, he is in awe of them. And then one day, after school, he finds himself walking beside one of them. She happens to say something about how dumb her parents are. And then he blurts out that he knows exactly what she means because his parents are just as dumb. And they discover that each understands the other, really. One thing leads to another, and before long he is sitting with her in the swing on her front porch, and after an hour or so he gets up the nerve to try and kiss her, and he knows she will slap his face and send him home. But lo and behold, she kisses him back. That night, as he walks home, those size 13 feet are 6 inches off the ground. He is in love. In English, we have one word which has to cover many different meanings. The Greeks had a word for each of them. Our word is love, and it can mean completely opposite things. For instance, we say things like, I love cheesecake, which means that I want to take the being of cheesecake and consume it, and to use its being to fill up my emptiness. This is the most frequent sense in which we use the word. It's simply the word for desire, and the technical name that the Greeks had for it was eros. That's the kind of love that our hero is in. The girl is making him feel valuable, important, worth the time of day, and understood. Lots of adults in our society feel misunderstood, not worth much, rejected, alone, empty. And many of these folks consult psychotherapists. Consider this woman. When we first see her, she is being shown into the office of Dr. Jones, and he asks her to have a seat and explain why she has decided to consult him. Well, she says that her old friends just won't have anything to do with her anymore. And he says, that's too bad. What seems to be the reason? And she says, it seems to be because I like pancakes. He says, well, that's strange. I don't see anything wrong with that. I like pancakes too. She says, oh, you do? You've got to see my collection. I've got trunks full of them. He gets her talking about pancakes and the other things that matter to her and that bother her. And he listens. He responds with understanding and concern. And finally, after 50 minutes, he says, I'm sorry, but your hour is up. I'll see you next week. And she leaves. Then he takes out a folder, and for 5 minutes he makes notes about their session. And then he puts that folder away, and for the next 5 minutes he reads from another folder about his next patient. And then he tells the receptionist to send the next patient in. So he begins by saying to the patient, now, last week you were telling me about so-and-so. And the patient says to himself, wow, he remembers what I told him. He really is interested in me. Well, the pancake lady follows the usual pattern and falls in love with her therapist. No one has ever understood me like that before. But eventually the day comes when she says to herself, of course he listens to me and takes an interest in me. I'm paying him $100 an hour to do it. So she starts displaying all sorts of negative behavior. She breaks the appointments. She tells him off. She throws things. And she just sits and won't talk. This behavior has a name. It's called reality testing. And if the therapist loses his patience with her, he blows it, and it's all over. But if he remains calm and lets her misbehave without retaliation, then she feels secure in her relationship. And then the day will come when the therapist will say, I really don't think there's much else I can do to help you. But if you ever need to talk, please call. I can always find time for you, and they part as friends. So psychotherapy has three stages. Dependency, the stage of being in love with the therapist. Hostility, which is reality testing. And then friendship. The therapist must not be dependent on the patient or the reality testing. When it comes, it will destroy the relationship, and they will part with bitterness. Being in love, like the boy and girl above, is really being in mutual psychotherapy. But remember, it is necessary for the therapist not to need the approval of the patient. But in the love affair, the therapist, the other lover, is completely different. So the therapy, the love affair, is doomed to end in bitterness. Lovers' quarrels are really reality testing. They start when the first hint appears that the other lover's interest is really in what he is getting out of the relationship. Notice what they quarrel about are things like, you said so and so, or some other indication of base or inadequate motive. Marriages are destroyed by people expecting their spouses to be therapists. If you need therapy, go to a priest or go to a counselor. But unfortunately, today's marriage manuals usually try to tell you how to turn your marriage into successful psychotherapy. Therapy is not what marriage is for. It has a very different purpose, and we'll get into that next time. All things tend to actualize their natures. That is, acorns tend to become oak trees, and children tend to grow up to be adults. We pray. They have a built-in tendency or desire to actually actualize humanity. Very early on, around 2, children start to learn certain basic facts. They learn the difference between big people and little people. They learn the difference between mama types and daddy types. Which type they are, some fail at this point. That he, she will never succeed in becoming completely adult, but only the male or the female part of adult humanity. So the next best thing for a boy to becoming both male and female adult is to be a man and to have a woman, one with which to pair bond. So Johnny begins to compose a dream girl in his mind, made up of the best qualities of all the women that he's ever experienced. Mother, aunts, sisters, teachers, actresses, friends, mothers, etc. And then one day, Johnny meets a woman, who seems like his dream girl, and he is in love. And while he is young, we call such love affairs crushes or puppy love. Well, as time goes on, his dream girl fantasy is still growing and changing. And he discovers things about his crush that aren't so nice at all. So he falls out of love with Alice and in love with Betsy. Johnny is really in love with his own fulfillment. When his affair with Alice or Betsy is going sour, he says to himself, she just won't do. But I've made love to her, and so if I reject her, I'll hate myself. He's also addicted to the approval that she has been giving him, so he hangs on even after the spell is broken. Johnny's dream girl doesn't exist anywhere except in his imagination, nor does mine. But she always loves me. She always understands me. She always approves of me, etc. And everything I've said about Johnny applies to Alice and Betsy and Carol and so on as well. And as the child grows up, he finds himself in progressively more dangerous situations, i.e., such as the first time his mother leaves him at home with a babysitter, or he's left at a nursery, or he goes to school, or he goes on a camping trip, or he goes off to summer camp. He always knows that when he is home with mother, everything's all right. Home is where he is loved and is safe and is cared for. But eventually, he cuts the apron strings. That is, he joins the Navy or goes to college or gets a job in another town. Then he can't go back home. He feels the need to establish a new home base. So whoever his current sweetheart is when this happens, that's the one he marries. But that doesn't change anything. It actually just complicates things legally. So people have quit complicating it legally. They realize it hasn't changed anything, and that is largely why they don't bother to get that piece of paper anymore. So one morning, 6 months after the wedding at breakfast, Johnny looks across the breakfast table at Mary and smells the burning toast, and he says to himself, "My God, I am married to that? Now I'm never going to find my dream girl, and it's all her fault." Now, he has 3 choices. Leave her for another, take on a mistress, or try to be a satisfactory husband. And if he chooses the third and says, "Well, I really blew it, but I made some solemn promises, so I'll play the man and do what I said I would," and at that point, real love begins to enter the picture. This brings us to the second kind of love, which is called agape. This is loving with the will, whether you feel like it or not. Love which is unasked, undemanded, on which there is no price tag, is self-verifying. It does away with the need for reality testing. So on those occasions when Johnny is not getting anything out of it, Mary isn't tempted to think he is doing it for what he is getting out of it. Of course, it is important that both know that agape love is going to be involved so that they will not be suspicious when it happens. Marriage is a 100% proposition. It is not a 50-50 deal. Jesus' prescription for us is, you have heard that it was said, you shall leave your neighbor, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes the sun to shine on evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? You therefore must be perfect, even as your heavenly Father is perfect. What Jesus means is, I'll scratch your back if it itches. If mine itches, I'll rub it on the bedpost. When both Johnny and Mary are loving in this way, each is getting an awful lot of love. Note that in the quotation, Jesus implies that there is reward in a certain kind of love. What reward have you? He does not say, what reward will you have? Jesus goes on to say, where a man's treasure is, there will his heart be also. That is the reason a woman loves her newborn baby. She has been inconvenienced and been made uncomfortable by it, thus investing herself in it for months before he is born. As Jesus says, she no longer remembers the anguish for joy that a child is born in the world. When agape love is persisted in, it gives way to joy. Jesus says, whoever would lose his life for my sake will find it. But if you try to stay on the level of eros love or desire, even that will dry up. Jesus also says, whoever would save his life will end up losing it. And agape love means drawing on the power of God to minister to my spouse. This is the opposite of eros love, which uses up my spouse for my own welfare. Eros does not teach me anything about the one I am desiring. I only see her or him, depending on where you are, in terms of my own needs. I do not see her as she really is, or as she may become. I do not really know her. But agape leads me to identify with her and become part of her, to invest myself in her. And then when she rejoices, I rejoice. And when she is sad, I am sad. I dwell in her and she dwells in me. This correspondence to the union between Christ and his bride, the church, as we pray in the Eucharist, that we may worthily receive the most precious body and blood of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Be filled with thy grace and heavenly benediction, and be made one body with him, that he may dwell in us, and we in him. This identification with my spouse is the fulfillment of that desire and longing which I discovered in childhood, to grow up and experience what it is to live as both man and woman. And this brings us to the third kind of love, philia, a Greek word which is not to be confused with filial love, which comes from the Latin. It's spelled differently and refers to something else. Philia, translated friendship, is actually a more profound notion than that would suggest. Jesus used the word at the Last Supper when he says, "This is my commandment, that ye love one another as I have loved you. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you, to love," the verbal form of agape, "love one another." Agape leads to philia. Agape involves dying to oneself and, in a sense, rising to new life in the beloved. The new life in the beloved is philia. Husband and wife become united as friends in Jesus' sense of the word. In fact, this is the fulfillment of his words, "The two shall become one flesh." In the epistle to the Hebrews, Jesus speaks of the way Jesus laid down his life for his bride, the church, in these words: "Let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking to, or keeping our eyes on, Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God." The philia, friendship, that comes out of agape love is also joy, and the lover rejoices in the beloved. So perhaps philia should be called joyful friendship. The Christian gospel is that we shall achieve the purpose for which we were made, that is, to know God, to love God, and to enjoy him forever. This is not a one-way relationship. We are also to be known, to be loved, to be enjoyed. In fact, we already are. When it is persisted in, holy matrimony leads to that kind of union between man and wife. They come to know and to be known, to love and to be loved, to enjoy and to be enjoyed. That union does not come without death to oneself. But that is, after all, what we should expect from St. Paul's words in the epistle to the Ephesians as he talks about marriage. "This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church." Holy matrimony, then, is a lifelong commitment to love, and to love without being able to run away from it. But everyone feels like doing that 1,000 times. Every natural affection has to die in order for God to replace it with supernatural joy, and that involves pain. The cross cannot be escaped. Just as a child must surrender his broken toy if daddy is going to fix it, so every married couple has to accept the replacement of that first kind of love, eros, that desire for the other with which the marriage begins. But we do it for the joy that is set before us. Marriage always works for the one who works it. If you love, even if your partner does not, you will become a lover, just like your Lord. So the church says, don't quit. Stick with it. Good times are coming.